Hey there, chess fans. Welcome back to the channel where we break down games move by move to help you sharpen your skills and understand the beautiful game a little better. Today, we're diving into a fascinating battle between opponent playing white and Bolt playing black. The opening phase here is pretty balanced, but there are some subtle moments worth unpacking, so let's jump right in. White kicks things off with d4, staking a claim in the center. This is a classic and solid way to start the game, aiming to control key central squares and open lines for the bishops and queen. Black replies with d5, mirroring white's move and contesting the center directly. This symmetrical response keeps the tension and sets the stage for a classical pawn structure battle. Now white plays c4, entering the territory of the queen's gambit. The key idea here is to challenge black's central pawn on d5 and potentially gain central dominance by offering a wing pawn. This move is all about creating tension and opening lines for development. Black develops the knight to f6, which is a natural developing move attacking the center and preparing to castle. However, here the engine suggests that e6 would have been a stronger choice. Why? Because e6 solidifies the d5 pawn and prepares to develop the dark squared bishop, maintaining a solid pawn chain. Choosing f6 instead slightly weakens black's control over the central dark squares, especially e5, and can lead to more complex play. So, the takeaway here is, when defending the center, sometimes reinforcing your pawns with moves like e6 is more reliable than immediate piece development. White develops the knight to c3, supporting the center and increasing pressure on d5. This is a natural developing move, but the engine points out that white missed the chance to capture on d5 immediately with c takes d5. Taking on d5 here would have simplified the center and could have given white a slight edge by opening lines and gaining space. Black develops the bishop to f5, aiming to put pressure on white's center and develop actively outside the pawn chain. This is a common theme in Queen's Gambit decline type positions, where black tries to get the light squared bishop out before locking it in with e6. However, the engine suggests that black could have grabbed the pawn on c4 with d takes c4 instead, which would have challenged white's center more directly and created immediate imbalance. White finally captures on d5 with c takes d5, opening the center and grabbing a pawn. This is a critical moment because white now has a tangible material advantage in the center, which can translate into better space and piece activity. Black recaptures with the knight on d5, maintaining piece activity and keeping the position balanced. This move is natural and helps black keep control of central squares. White brings the queen out to b3, targeting the b7 pawn and putting pressure on black's queenside. This move also eyes the d5 knight indirectly, increasing tension. Black decides to capture the knight on c3 with the knight from d5. This is an interesting choice because it exchanges a centralized knight for white's knight, but it also helps black reduce white's control over the center. The engine shows a slight advantage here for black, indicating this was a good strategic decision. White recaptures with the pawn on c3, keeping the pawn structure intact and maintaining central presence. Black plays b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop or support the c5 square. This is a flexible move that helps black develop the queenside and control important dark squares. White develops the bishop to a3, aiming to exchange black's active light squared bishop. This is a strategic idea to weaken black's control over the dark squares and reduce black's piece activity. Black develops the knight to c6, reinforcing the center and preparing to challenge white's control over the d4 square. This is a standard developing move, supporting key central squares. White develops the knight to f3, continuing smooth development and preparing to castle. This also supports the center and prepares for potential e4 pushes. Black maneuvers the knight to a5, targeting white's queen and the bishop on a3. This is a tactical idea to gain space on the queenside and challenge white's pieces. White checks with the queen on a4 check, forcing black to respond and disrupting black's coordination. This is a useful way to gain a tempo and keep black's pieces tied down. Black blocks the check with the queen on d7, a solid defensive move that also connects the rooks and prepares for potential exchanges. White captures the queen on d7 check, initiating a queen trade. This is a critical moment because trading queens often simplifies the position and can favor the player with better pawn structure or piece activity. Black recaptures with the bishop on d7, keeping material balanced and maintaining piece activity. White pushes e4, gaining space in the center and opening lines for the light-squared bishop and queen. This move also challenges Black's pawn structure and prepares for further central expansion. Black responds with e6, solidifying the center and preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop. This move also keeps the position flexible and prevents White from pushing e5 too easily. White captures the rook on f8 with the bishop, grabbing material and weakening Black's kingside. This is a sharp tactical decision that gives White a material edge. Black recaptures with the rook on f8, restoring material balance and keeping the position playable. White plays bishop a6, moving the bishop to a6. This is a subtle positional move, aiming to exchange off Black's important dark-squared bishop, which is a key defender around Black's king and central dark squares. By trading this bishop, White hopes to weaken Black's control over the dark squares and create potential targets later on. Black's position remains solid here, and the evaluation is nearly equal, so no major tactical fireworks yet. Black calmly responds with king e7, moving the king one step forward. This might look odd at first, but the key idea is to connect the rooks and prepare for central and kingside defense. Black is also anticipating the possibility of castling queenside or simply centralizing the king for the upcoming endgame. This is a flexible move that keeps options open. White castles kingside with short castling, a natural and necessary step to safeguard the king and bring the rook into play. Castling here also helps White coordinate the pieces for central and kingside activity. The evaluation dips slightly, but this is more about the position's natural tension than a mistake. Black plays rook fd8, placing the rook on the open d-file. This is a textbook strategic move, as controlling open files is a fundamental principle. The rook eyes the d4 pawn and supports potential central breaks. Both sides are jockeying for control of the center and key squares. White develops the knight to knight d2, aiming to reroute it to better squares like c4 or e4. This is a common maneuver to increase pressure on Black's center and queenside. The evaluation shifts slightly, reflecting the subtle repositioning rather than a big mistake. Black moves the king back to king f8. This is a small waiting move, but here the engine points out a missed opportunity. c5 would have been stronger. Why? Because pushing c5 challenges White's center immediately, opening lines for Black's pieces and gaining space on the queenside. Instead, moving the king back is a bit passive and misses the chance to seize the initiative. The lesson here is, when you have the chance to challenge your opponent's center with pawn breaks, especially c5 in these structures, it's often better to act than to wait. White pushes a4, expanding on the queenside. This move tries to gain space and prevent Black's b5 push, but the engine suggests knight b3 would have been better. Why? Because knight b3 would have targeted Black's knight on a5 and prepared to control the c5 square, limiting Black's counterplay. So, while a4 is not a blunder, it's a bit slow and misses a more active plan. Black plays g6, reinforcing the f5 bishop's diagonal and preventing White's pieces from infiltrating on f5 or h5. The engine suggests bishop c8 would have been stronger here, aiming to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal and support the center better. This is a classic example of how piece placement can be more important than pawn moves in complex middle games. White pushes f4, trying to gain space and open lines on the kingside. This is a thematic break in these types of positions, aiming to challenge Black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. However, it also slightly weakens White's e4 pawn and dark squares, so it's a double-edged move. Black responds with rook a b8, bringing the rook to the b-file. This move prepares for queenside counterplay, especially targeting the b2 pawn and supporting potential pawn breaks like b5. Both sides are clearly gearing up for a battle on opposite wings. White repositions the bishop to bishop b5, putting pressure on Black's c6 knight and controlling important squares. This move also eyes the d7 bishop and can create tactical threats if Black is not careful. Black plays c6, solidifying the center and kicking the bishop away. This is a good strategic move, preventing White's bishop from becoming too active and preparing to push c5 later. White retreats the bishop to bishop d3, maintaining pressure on the center and keeping an eye on black's kingside. This move also supports the e4 pawn and prepares for potential kingside attacks. Black pushes c5, challenging white's center directly. This is a critical strategic break, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and undermine white's pawn chain. The position remains balanced, but black's plan is clear: open the center and activate the rooks. White responds with d5, pushing forward to close the center and gain space. This move locks the center and tries to restrict black's piece activity, but it also fixes the pawn structure, which can be a double-edged sword. Black captures on d5 with e takes d5. This opens the e-file and creates tension in the center. Importantly, black now has a slight material advantage, as the pawn structure favors black. The key idea here is that black's pieces become more active, and white's pawns are more vulnerable. White recaptures with e takes d5, maintaining material balance but opening lines for black's rooks. This move keeps the tension but also gives black targets to attack. Black plays rook bc8, doubling rooks on the c-file and increasing pressure on white's c4 pawn. The engine suggests that bishop f5 would have been better here, developing the bishop actively and putting more pressure on white's center. This shows how piece activity often trumps rook maneuvers alone. White pushes c4, trying to solidify the center and prevent black's rooks from infiltrating. This move is logical but somewhat passive, giving black time to improve their position. Black plays rook c7, doubling rooks and preparing to invade on the 7th rank. This is a typical plan in positions with open files. Control the 7th rank and target pawns behind enemy lines. White moves the knight to knight e4, centralizing it and aiming to challenge black's bishop. However, this is a significant mistake. The engine shows a big drop here, indicating white missed a better move. h3. Why is knight e4 problematic? Because it allows black to exchange off a key defender and increase pressure on white's position. Black responds with bishop f5, attacking the knight and gaining control over important central squares. This move exploits white's misplaced knight and prepares to dominate the center. White plays rook fd1, bringing the rook to d1 to contest the open file. Unfortunately, this move is another missed opportunity. The engine suggests rook ac1 would have been better, supporting the c4 pawn and preparing counterplay on the queenside. Instead, white's rook is less active and unable to prevent black's threats. Black captures the knight on e4 with bishop takes e4, winning a piece and gaining a decisive material advantage. This is the turning point where black's advantage becomes overwhelming. The key takeaway here is that allowing your opponent to exchange off key defenders without adequate preparation can lead to losing material and position. White plays bishop takes e4, capturing black's bishop on e4. This is a natural recapture, but notice the evaluation already favors black by nearly 3 pawns here. The key idea is that black's knight on a5 is still very active, and white's pieces are somewhat cramped. White is trying to simplify, but black's positional plus and material edge remain strong. Black responds with knight takes c4, capturing the c4 pawn. This move is excellent because it not only wins a pawn but also centralizes the knight on a strong outpost. The knight on c4 now threatens key squares and restricts white's bishop and rook activity. Black's material advantage grows, and the knight's activity is a huge factor here. White pushes f5, trying to open lines and gain kingside space. However, this move actually worsens white's position significantly, dropping the evaluation by over half a pawn. The engine suggests king f2 would have been better here, aiming to bring the king closer to the center and support the pawns. Why is f5 problematic? Because it weakens white's kingside pawn structure and opens lines that black can exploit with precise piece play. This is a classic example of how pushing pawns without full preparation can backfire, especially when your king is still somewhat exposed. Black plays knight e3, moving the knight to a powerful central square. This move attacks white's rook and increases pressure on white's position. However, the engine points out that rook e7 would have been even stronger, reinforcing the 7th rank and preparing to double rooks. Still, knight e3 is a very good move that capitalizes on white's weaknesses. White pushes d6, advancing the pawn to try and create counterplay. This is an ambitious attempt to open lines and activate pieces, but unfortunately, it actually worsens white's position further. The engine suggests f takes g6 would have been better, opening the kingside and creating potential threats against black's king. By pushing d6, white fixes a target that black can attack and loses flexibility. The lesson here is that advancing past pawns can be powerful, but only when supported properly, otherwise they become liabilities. Black plays rook cd7, doubling rooks on the d-file and increasing pressure on white's advanced pawn. This is a textbook strategic move, consolidating control over the open file and preparing to attack the d6 pawn. Black's coordination here is excellent, and white's position is becoming more difficult to defend. White captures on g6 with f takes g6, trying to open lines and create threats. However, this move turns out to be a big mistake, dropping the evaluation by more than 1.2 pawns. The engine suggests rook d3 would have been better, aiming to contest the d-file and support the d6 pawn. By taking on g6, white opens the h-file but also weakens the kingside structure and allows black to capture with tempo. This is a great example of how opening lines can be a double-edged sword, especially when your king's safety is compromised. Black captures the rook on d1 with knight takes d1. This is a decisive tactical blow, winning a whole rook and increasing black's material advantage to nearly 5 pawns. The knight's fork here is crushing, and white's position collapses rapidly. The key idea is that black's knight is perfectly placed to exploit white's loose pieces and weak back rank. This move teaches us the importance of piece coordination and the dangers of leaving major pieces undefended. White captures on h7 with g takes h7, promoting a passed pawn and threatening black's king. Although this looks dangerous, black's material advantage and piece activity more than compensate. White's last hope is to create counterplay with this advanced pawn, but black's king is ready to meet the threat. Black calmly moves the king to king g7, stepping out of the pawn's attack and preparing to capture it if needed. This is a precise defensive move, showing how important king activity is in the endgame. Black's king is now perfectly placed to support the rook and knight, while white's threats are minimal. White captures the knight on d1 with rook takes d1. This recapture is forced but doesn't solve white's problems. Black's material advantage remains overwhelming, and white's pieces are still poorly coordinated. Black captures the d6 pawn with rook takes d6, further consolidating material advantage and removing white's advanced pawn. This move also opens the d-file for black's rook to invade, increasing pressure on white's position. White plays rook f1, trying to activate the rook and defend key squares. While logical, this move is too little too late. Black's material superiority and active pieces mean white's rook has limited scope. Black invades with rook d1, placing the rook deep into white's territory. This is a classic demonstration of rook activity in the endgame, penetrating the opponent's position to attack pawns and restrict the king. White's bishop alone cannot stop this invasion. White pushes h3, a waiting move to create luft for the king and prevent back rank threats. This is a small but necessary step, though it does not change the evaluation significantly. Black captures on f1 with rook takes f1 check, exchanging rooks and simplifying into a winning endgame. This move increases black's material advantage to nearly 7 pawns, a decisive margin. The key takeaway here is that simplifying when ahead in material is often the best strategy to convert your advantage. White recaptures with king takes f1. Forced, but now white's king is more exposed and the material deficit is huge. Black plays rook d4, centralizing the rook and preparing to attack white's bishop and pawns. This move also restricts white's king and limits its mobility. White retreats the bishop to bishop c2, trying to keep it active and defend key squares. However, this is a passive move, and black's advantage remains overwhelming. Black pushes f5, aiming to open lines and create passed pawns. The engine suggests rook d2 would have been stronger, increasing pressure on white's position and cutting off the king. This shows how precise rook maneuvers can maximize winning chances in the endgame. White moves the king to king e2, centralizing it and trying to support the bishop. Unfortunately, the engine points out that g3 would have been better, creating luft and preventing black's pawns from advancing easily. This is a good reminder that king safety and pawn structure remain critical even in simplified positions. Black captures the pawn on h7 with king takes h7, removing white's last advanced pawn. The engine suggests f4 would have been stronger, aiming to open lines and create decisive threats. This move still keeps black's winning advantage intact. White plays bishop takes f5 check, delivering a check and capturing a pawn. This is a last-ditch attempt to create complications, but black's king simply steps aside. Black moves the king to king g7, escaping the check and maintaining the winning position. Black's material advantage and active pieces mean white's resistance is futile. White plays bishop c2, retreating the bishop to c2. This move is a bit passive and doesn't challenge black's dominance. Notice that white still has the bishop, but black's rook and king are much more active, and this bishop is somewhat sidelined. The key idea here is that white is trying to maintain some control over the long diagonal and keep the bishop safe, but it's not enough to stop black's plan. Black responds with king f6, bringing the king closer to the center and supporting the rook. This is a very strong move because in endgames, king activity is crucial, and black's king is now perfectly placed to support pawn advances and restrict white's bishop. The king's journey towards the center and kingside pawns is a textbook example of activating the king in the endgame. White pushes g4, trying to create some space and maybe challenge black's king. While this is an understandable attempt to gain counterplay, it actually weakens white's pawn structure further and opens lines for black's king and rook to invade. The key takeaway is that pawn moves in the endgame must be very carefully calculated because they can create weaknesses that are easy to exploit. Black moves the king to king g5. This move is good, but the engine suggests king e5 would have been even stronger. Why? Because king e5 centralizes the king more effectively, controlling key squares and cutting off white's king from approaching the center. Instead, king g5 allows white a bit more freedom, but black's advantage remains overwhelming. The lesson here is that king centralization is often more powerful than chasing pawns on the flank in endgames. White plays king f3, moving the king closer to the center. However, this move misses a better alternative, king e3. King e3 would have kept the king more flexible and better positioned to support the bishop and pawns. Instead, king f3 allows black to increase pressure and restrict white's king movement more easily. This position teaches us the importance of king placement in the endgame. The king should control key central squares and support your pieces actively. Black plays king h4, moving the king to the edge of the board. This might look strange, but it's actually a waiting move, preparing to capture white's pawns on the kingside. The engine suggests rook d2 would have been stronger here, increasing rook activity and cutting off white's king. This shows how rook activity and king coordination are key in converting advantages in the endgame. White plays bishop f5, trying to activate the bishop and challenge black's king. However, this move misses the better alternative king e3, which would have centralized the king and improved white's defensive chances. The bishop move is too slow and doesn't prevent black's plan of capturing pawns and advancing. This is a classic example of how piece activity alone isn't enough if your king is out of play in the endgame. Black captures the pawn on a4 with rook takes a4. This is a strong, concrete move that increases black's material advantage and opens the a-file for further rook activity. The key idea here is that capturing pawns and creating passed pawns in the endgame is often decisive, especially when your pieces are more active. White pushes g5, trying to create counterplay on the kingside. Unfortunately, this move doesn't change the evaluation much and actually weakens white's pawn structure further. The lesson here is that pushing pawns without sufficient support can create more weaknesses than threats. Black captures the pawn with king takes g5. This move is very strong because it removes white's last pawn on the kingside and further activates black's king. The king is now perfectly placed to support the rook and push pawns on the queenside. White plays bishop d7, trying to keep the bishop active and control key squares. However, this move is too slow to stop black's plan. White's bishop is somewhat trapped and unable to create meaningful threats. Black plays rook d4, centralizing the rook and increasing pressure on white's position. This move prepares to invade white's territory and supports the advance of black's pawns. It's a textbook example of rook activity dominating the board in the endgame. White moves the king to king e3. This is a critical moment where white misses a better defensive resource. Bishop c6. Bishop c6 would have helped control key squares and slowed black's pawn advance. Instead, king e3 walks into black's plan, allowing black to increase pressure and push pawns more freely. The takeaway here is that sometimes the best defense is to activate your pieces to control critical squares, not just move the king forward. Black moves the king back to king h4. This seems like a waiting move, but the engine suggests that rook takes d7 would have been stronger, capturing the bishop and simplifying into a winning position. This highlights the importance of looking for concrete captures and exchanges when you have a winning advantage. White plays bishop g4, trying to keep the bishop active and challenge black's king. Unfortunately, this move doesn't change the evaluation and white remains on the back foot. Black pushes a5, starting to advance the queenside pawns. This is a powerful strategic idea, creating passed pawns on the flank that white cannot stop. The key lesson here is that in endgames, creating and pushing passed pawns is often the decisive plan. White plays bishop e6, trying to keep the bishop active and block black's pawns. However, this move is too slow, and black's pawns are too far advanced. Black pushes a4, continuing the pawn advance. This move increases the pressure on white's position and threatens to create a passed pawn on a3. The lesson here is that when you have a material advantage, pushing pawns supported by your pieces is a winning strategy. White retreats the bishop to bishop d7. This move is a big mistake, dropping the evaluation sharply. The better move was bishop a2, which would have helped control the a3 square and slowed black's pawn advance. By moving back to d7, white allows black's pawns to march forward unhindered. The key takeaway is that in pawn races, controlling the promotion squares is critical. Black pushes a3, creating a passed pawn just one step from promotion. This is a decisive strategic breakthrough, and white's position is collapsing. White plays bishop e6, trying to block the pawn advance. However, this is too little too late, and black's advantage is overwhelming. Black pushes b5, supporting the a-pawn and preparing to push further. This move consolidates black's queenside majority and prepares to create multiple passed pawns. White moves the king to king f3. This is another critical moment where white misses a better move. Bishop a2. Bishop a2 would have helped stop black's pawns and create some defensive chances. Instead, king f3 is too slow and allows black to continue pushing pawns freely. Black pushes b4, advancing the queenside pawns further. This move increases black's winning chances dramatically by creating unstoppable passed pawns. The missed alternative c4 would have been even stronger, cutting off white's bishop and king more effectively. This final push seals black's victory. White plays king e3, stepping the king forward to e3. Now, this move might seem natural, trying to centralize the king, but here it's actually a big strategic slip. The engine shows a huge swing in evaluation. Black's advantage jumps by nearly 5 pawns. Why is this so bad? Because king f2 would have been a much better defensive resource, keeping the king closer to the pawns and avoiding black's deadly threats. The key idea here is that in such endgames, king safety and proximity to your pawns is critical. Stepping too far forward can walk into mating nets or lose material. Black responds with rook d8, moving the rook to d8. This is a strong, straightforward move, aiming to cut off white's king and prepare for the final assault. However, the engine suggests king g5 would have been even stronger, activating the king to support the rook and pawns more directly. This highlights a key endgame theme, coordinating your king and rook to dominate the board and restrict the opponent's king. White plays king e2, retreating the king back to e2. Unfortunately, this doesn't improve white's position much and misses the chance to play king f2 again, which would have been safer. The problem is white's king is still too exposed, and black's pieces are poised to deliver a decisive blow. This position teaches us that in critical endgames, precise king placement can be the difference between survival and immediate loss. Black plays rook e8, shifting the rook to e8. This move sets up a forced mate sequence. Black's rook now controls the e-file, cutting off escape squares for white's king. The evaluation is now a forced mate in 4 moves, showing how quickly a small inaccuracy can turn into a decisive tactical finish. White tries king d3, moving the king to d3 in a desperate attempt to escape. But this is futile. Black's advantage remains overwhelming, and the mating net tightens. The lesson here is that once your king is trapped and your opponent's rook is active, it's almost impossible to avoid mate without earlier precise defense. Black captures the bishop with rook takes e6. This is a crushing blow. By removing White's last active piece, Black simplifies into a winning rook and pawn endgame with a decisive material edge. The key takeaway is that trading off your opponent's active pieces when you have a winning advantage is often the best practical strategy. White plays king c4, moving the king toward the queenside pawns. This is a natural attempt to create counterplay by capturing pawns, but it's too little too late. Black's material advantage and mating threats are overwhelming. Black pushes a2, advancing the pawn to the brink of promotion. This is a textbook example of pushing past pawns in the endgame. Once you have a material advantage, creating unstoppable promotion threats is a winning plan. White captures the pawn on c5 with king takes c5. While capturing pawns is generally good, here it actually speeds up Black's victory by allowing Black to promote quickly. A better defensive try might have been to stay closer to the promotion square, but honestly, the position is already lost. Black promotes with a1 equals q, turning the pawn into a queen. This is the final nail in the coffin. Black now has a queen and rook against just a lone king, making mate inevitable. The key lesson here is the power of passed pawns supported by active pieces in the endgame. White captures the pawn on b4 with king takes b4. This move is understandable but misses a better alternative, king c4, which would have kept the king closer to the center and delayed mate a bit longer. However, at this stage, Black's overwhelming material advantage and mating threats mean White's fate is sealed. Before we wrap up, if you're enjoying this deep dive into chess strategy and endgame technique, don't forget to subscribe to Ongalibal's Chess Journey channel for more insightful game analyses and tips. Your support helps us bring you more content like this. Alright, chess friends, what can we take away from this endgame phase? First, precise king placement is absolutely critical. A single misstep can open the door to a mating net or lost material. Second, coordinating your rook and king to restrict the opponent's king and push past pawns is a winning formula. And finally, when you have a winning advantage, trading off your opponent's active pieces simplifies the path to victory. Thanks for sticking with me through this thrilling finish. Keep practicing these endgame principles, and you'll see your results improve dramatically. Until next time, keep those kings active and those passed pawns rolling. And remember, if you haven't already, subscribe to Ongalibal's Chess Journey channel to stay updated with all the latest content. Happy chess! Oh, and one last reminder. Subscribing to Ongalibal's Chess Journey channel is the best way to keep sharpening your skills and enjoying great chess content. Don't miss out.